Although Kansas is a state well known for its tornadoes, the town of Stockton that lies therein is an exception to the rule, with the outlying example of a notable tornado in early April of 1991. Although it was overshadowed by the Andover F5 tornado 2 weeks afterward, this twister would leave its own mark on tornado history. At first, there was no indication that such would be the case. The tornado touched down west of Stockton, but bypassed the town itself, and remained over the open prairie until it dissipated further to the north. The effects of this whirlwind included the destruction of one house, one vehicle, and one injury, but after being issued a rating of F3 on the Fujita scale, the event was quickly forgotten. Not long after, a farmer named Robert Melcher was repairing fence posts on his property near Winnetoon, Nebraska, when he noticed a canceled check that did not belong to him in the grass. He promptly turned the check into a bank, but was later informed that its owner had lost it in a tornado. As it turned out, the victim lived near Stockton, but no tornadoes had occurred near Winnetoon, where the check was recovered. When the Stockton twister destroyed the only house in its path, it sucked up many items, including the check, personal heirlooms, and a collection of Elvis memorabilia. The items were then carried by the tornado into the anvil of the cloud that generated the twister. From there, the winds of the thunderstorm effortlessly carried the check northward into Nebraska. Based on the residence where the check came from and where it ended up, it was determined that it had traveled 223 miles, or 359 kilometers from its point of origin. The World Meteorological Organization now recognizes the debris of the Stockton tornado as the most widely traveled in recorded history. However, the eerie and disturbing quality of this event was not limited to the events of April 11th alone. In the years following, concerned researchers and scientists have expressed fears that future tornadoes could pick up and carry hazardous chemicals or biohazardous waste and deposit them into faraway communities without warning, with nuclear power plants and environmental cleanup sites being considered prime candidates. Among the many unforgettable days in weather history, March 18, 1925 stands alone. On that day, the United States of America experienced its most lethal tornado, long before tornado warnings, storm sirens, or modern meteorology could give most people a fighting chance. What later became known as the Tri-State Tornado touched down near Ellington, Missouri, and would not leave the ground until Princeton, Indiana. A staggering journey of 219 miles, or 352 kilometers across 3 states. While most of the tornado's devastation occurred in Illinois, its legendary status comes from more than just distance. For roughly 3.5 hours, the tornado tore through city after city in an era without modern forecasting, building codes, or tornado safety, claiming 695 lives along its path. During that time, its average forward speed hovered around 62 miles per hour, already ranking it among the fastest tornadoes ever recorded, even a century after the fact. Yet this average figure obscures the upper bound of the tornado's velocity. In Jackson County, Illinois, between the cities of Gorham and Murphysboro, it surged even further ahead to a top speed of 73 miles per hour, faster than a typical car on an American highway. Eyewitnesses later recorded that in many towns, the tornado's vortex was barely visible. The wide funnel, driving rain, and dark clouds of the surrounding thunderstorm made it nearly impossible to recognize the threat until it was nearly on top of those in its path. Even if people had seen it coming, the speed of the storm left little to no chance of escape. Taken together, these factors combined to make Murphysboro the deadliest tornado-stricken community in U.S. history. a city caught in the path of the nation's deadliest and fastest tornado. The momentum of such a violent twister, and many others like it, later influenced official and scientific advice against outrunning a tornado by vehicle, especially from within its expected path. The speed, scale, and destruction of this tornado later led to its classification as an F5 twister when the Fujita scale was developed in the 1970s. Across the United States and even the world, there are many communities, large and small, whose history, recent or otherwise, has been defined by severe and even violent tornadoes. However, among events as uncommon as the latter, it is even more uncommon that such a tornado destroys the majority of a community in its path, and practically unheard of to destroy all of it, with the most recent instance involving the EF5 tornado that damaged 95% of the town of Greensburg, Kansas in 2007. Yet even this occurrence, apocalyptic for such a small town, was outdone 7 decades earlier, and also within Tornado Alley. The F5 tornado of April 9, 1947, was mostly infamous for its impact on the towns of Woodward, Oklahoma, and Higgins, Texas, but on a proportional scale, the worst of its destruction occurred further south in Hemphill County, Texas. After touching down near the county seat of Canadian, the tornado narrowly avoided this first community and made its approach on the small town of Glazier. At this point, the tornado was so wide that the edges of the funnel were not completely visible to observers. Over a mile in diameter, just before impact, it swept across the town at F5 strength, swallowing it whole in the process. No part of the community survived unscathed. Of the 39 houses in Glazier before the tornado touched down, all but one were destroyed. Among all the buildings in the town, only the jail and one residence were left standing, and even those were heavily damaged. From above, the community looked as though it had been bulldozed with only the streets left behind. Those who witnessed the aftermath compared it to the epicenter of a nuclear blast. The destruction was so thorough and complete that many survivors became lost, wandering over the prairies as far as Amarillo and other towns, searching for friends, families, and possessions. In the end, 17 people, or nearly 10% of Glazier's population, lost their lives, and although the vast majority of residents made it through alive, most refused to rebuild in an area that had been left so utterly desolate. While Greensburg eventually recovered from its own EF5 twister, Glazier sadly would not. The surviving inhabitants soon relocated to the nearby towns, many of which had also been devastated, and after doing so, they never looked back. Today, Glazier consists of a few scattered houses and trailers across the countryside in the same general area as the pre-tornado townsite, but nothing resembling its former self. The population of some 200 residents before the tornado dwindled to just 45 people in 1990 and 60 people in 2020, and none of the businesses that existed before the disaster have since returned to the area. Whenever there is a tornado of note, the trauma inflicted on people and the damage on buildings often leaves the natural landscape a footnote by comparison. On April 27, 2011, 4 EF5 tornadoes touched down across the southeastern United States. 2 of them occurred in the state of Mississippi, with one tracking from Smithville to the Alabama town of Bexar, and the other from Philadelphia to Moshulville, Mississippi. Although it was the less deadly of the 2, the Philadelphia tornado made many headlines in its own right. Already monstrously powerful, with winds blowing at over 200 miles per hour, the whirlwind took the lives of 3 people over the course of 30 minutes. However, the body count of the storm and the typical expected EF5 damage would not be what carved the Philadelphia Twister's name into stone. Rather, it would be its effect on the natural landscape. In northeastern Neshoba County and northwestern Kemper County, a field was discovered in which the tornado dug a trench 2 feet deep into the soil, a depth greater than almost every kind of road in the United States, including highways. What made the scene even more marvelous to damaged surveyors was the fact that this field had never been cultivated or transformed in any way before April 27th. It is hard to fully describe the sheer physical force required to rip that much compacted soil out of the earth for even a fraction of the tornado's path. The grass along the funnel's path was completely gone, and large trees were pulled completely out of the earth, stripped of their bark and leaves, and thrown dozens of yards from where they had left the ground. You might as well imagine taking a shovel, digging a hole up to your knees, and continuing to dig that hole 1/2 mile wide and many more miles long. The degree of damage to the Mississippi landscape was later used to officially designate the Philadelphia Twister as an EF5. Fortunately, the massive gash left in the ground by the tornado was located far away from human habitations, and nobody was hurt or killed in the vicinity of the trench. A twister of such staggering power could tear apart infrastructure and housing, not just above ground, but beneath it as well. Depending on the type of foundation, the loss of 2 feet of earth immediately next to a basement could cause the foundation to destabilize, collapse, or disappear altogether. Thankfully, no such event occurred in the Philadelphia tornado, but something similar would occur elsewhere in the Deep South on the same day. More scouring would occur along the length of the tornado's path, including a road where the layer of asphalt was torn off. However, the most incredible of its earthen damage had already been inflicted, and no tornado known to man has caused such extreme damage to the natural landscape before or since. Canadians are certainly no stranger to violent tornadoes, having borne witness to the Regina, Saskatchewan tornado of 1912, the Edmonton, Alberta tornado of 1987, and the Barrie, Ontario tornado of 1985, all of them rated F4 on the Fujita scale. Despite the presence of 20 officially designated F4 tornadoes, it was not until June 2007 that Canada would record its very first F5 twister in the small southerly town of Elie, Manitoba. With only 500 residents, Elie is not a large community, and only a small segment of the town site was impacted by the tornado of June 22nd. The parts impacted, however, were subject to overwhelming devastation, much of it in a novel manner. The tornado mostly or completely demolished 4 houses, all of them considered well constructed by damaged surveyors, and it did so when the twister itself was near its end. One of these dwellings became more notable than the rest due to the manner in which it was destroyed. In the aftermath, preliminary assessments thought the damage to this house was from a low-end F4 tornado, but that was before they fully learned what had happened to the structure. The funnel spent no longer than 30 seconds over each residence, but in that brief window of time, the house in question was sheared off its foundation at ground level. Not only was the house pushed off its site, but it was picked up in its entirety by the winds of the tornado. Traveling through the volatile airspace just above treetop height, the above-ground structure remained intact for a handful of seconds before suddenly exploding in a shower of debris. As the air pressure dropped outside the house, the pressure inside the house increased conversely, and the frame structure of the residence could no longer hold together. After the house disintegrated, the wreckage was dispersed so widely that none of the debris was found on the property. Instead, only the foundation and the basement remained. The whole spectacle was caught on camera by a storm chaser named Justin Hobson, who has since written extensively about the tornado. Amazingly, there were several people inside the basement of this house at the time of the incident, all of whom survived without injury. The living space in the basement itself was trashed, but remained structurally intact. Had those inside been above ground in the same house, they almost certainly would have perished. As a general rule, it is established that the safest place to shelter in a tornado is an interior room on the lowest floor of a strongly constructed building, especially a basement. For any given rule, however, there may well be exceptions. Beyond the anxieties and terrors of a typical tornado outbreak, the super outbreak of 1974 wrote in blood and rubble that future such events were not only possible, but even likely. The respite finally ran out on April 27, 2011, when an even greater outbreak saw tornadoes tear through many of the same areas that had been hit in 1974. After 3 days of hell, the ordeal was over. 368 twisters were confirmed to have touched down, even more than in the prior super outbreak. One in particular remains a household name, carving through 3 towns in a row, and at EF5 strength in each of them. Even for the highest intensity that the enhanced Fujita scale allows, this whirlwind was in a league all its own. In the assessments damage surveyors provide to governments and the public, it is common to hear that such strong tornadoes often level homes completely, sweeping them off their foundations and so forth. But the Phil Campbell tornado didn't just leave the foundations behind in the areas of its worst damage. 2 storm shelters were torn out of the ground in Hackleburg, in addition to the flattening and disintegration of many other structures. When the tornado reached Phil Campbell, the roof was torn off of yet another underground storm shelter, but even then, the devastation did not end there. Perhaps the most awe-inspiring damage was found along Bonner Street in Phil Campbell, where a line of well-constructed homes with basements was reduced to nothing but concrete foundations. It is unknown if anybody was inside these houses at the time. The foundations themselves were broken, cracked, or shattered, leaving the ruined homes as little more than gaping holes in the ground with earthen walls. Originally, these foundations had been made of concrete blocks held together by mortar and reinforced with steel, weaker than the larger blocks of poured concrete that are more common in more recent buildings. Yet even that distinction is not the end of the story. In Mount Hope, the third and final location at which EF5 damage was recorded, there was once a roadside steakhouse that was completely leveled by the whirlwind. Once the tornado passed over, the only sign the steakhouse had ever been there was a pile of rubble off to the side of where the building once sat. The steakhouse rested on a poured concrete foundation that was exposed to the extreme forces of the tornado's winds, and under the incredible stress, the foundation buckled and split, with a portion violently pulled part way out of the ground. Although nobody was inside, having evacuated in the face of the oncoming twister, the damage at this site was in some ways even more spectacular than that on Phil Campbell's Bonner Street. Unlike many buildings in Mount Hope and elsewhere along the tornado's path, the restaurant has not been rebuilt. Among local residents, its absence and the story behind it are unsettling reminders of what was briefly America's deadliest twister, and one of its most powerful to this day. In May 1997, residents of Jarrell, Texas would endure one of the most catastrophic tornadoes in American history. Not only would its winds reach those of F5 strength, But because it lingered at a slow forward speed, the horrific damage that would have been expected from such a twister was magnified and prolonged on both living creatures and structures. 40 houses in the Double Creek Estates subdivision were completely leveled. The only sign that any homes had ever been there were the bare cement slabs and driveways left behind after the tornado. In that area, trees were completely stripped of bark, and there were no large pieces of man-made debris. For all intents and purposes, the area had been swept clean. With such damage to both structures and natural obstacles, the effects of such powerful winds upon exposed humans and animals would be unfathomable. All of those who perished in the Jarrell tornado lived in the Double Creek Estates neighborhood, but there were additional casualties as well, which were discovered in the most nightmarish fashion. Near Double Creek were several pastures where over 300 cattle were killed by the tornado. To say that they were killed, however, does not fully do justice to the horrific nature of the experience. Considering what the tornado did to houses, trees, and vehicles, the effects of F5 wind speeds, with or without debris, would be catastrophic to unprotected flesh. By some freakish combination of sand, soil, debris, and wind speeds as high as 260 miles per hour, the outer layers of skin on the cattle had been stripped off, leaving behind what one rescuer called, quote, empty sacks of bones, whose skin was bright red as blood had been sucked to the surface by the pressure. Another survivor claimed that the cattle looked like stripped leather on the outside, and many had their legs missing. Some of their lungs had been pulled out of their mouths, and most of their bodies had been picked up and strewn over the landscape. Emergency personnel attempted to deny entry to visitors and spectators who did not already live in the area, but it was impossible to completely hide the horrific scene strewn all over the landscape. None of the cattle were reported to have survived, and their shredded remains were sometimes scattered among those of the tornado's human victims, which made it even more difficult to count the bodies soon after the disaster. Following a widely publicized miscount of 30 deaths, a revised total of 27 fatalities became the official body count of the Jarrell tornado. The state of Oklahoma is sometimes called the tornado mecca of the world for the sheer number of twisters that occur there. It is the tornado alley of Tornado Alley itself, not just for the number of such storms, but also for what they can do. On May 3, 1999, one of the strongest and most infamous tornadoes known to humankind tore through several towns and cities in central Oklahoma, claiming the lives of 36 people, shredding 8,000 structures to the ground, and dealing $1 billion worth of damage. At its greatest extent, the funnel was over a mile wide, but its destruction and magnitude would not be all that cemented its legacy. Before it reached Moore, Oklahoma City, or the other well-known cities in its path, this violent tornado crossed through the tiny rural community of Bridge Creek. Lacking any tornado sirens, the small settlement of several hundred people had no idea what was about to happen on the ground and just above their heads. When the tornado passed over Bridge Creek, it did so at F5 strength. From a distance that ranged from 2 to 5 miles from the base of the funnel, a Doppler on wheels truck recorded the inner workings of the tornado, working in conjunction with 2 other such trucks. In Bridge Creek itself, about 32 meters above ground level, wind speeds of 302 miles per hour, or 486 kilometers per hour, were measured as they occurred over a radius of about 100 meters inside the tornado. Later reinterpretation of the original data revised this figure to an upper limit of 321 miles per hour, or 517 kilometers per hour. Unofficially speaking, the winds of this tornado were not only the strongest ever recorded in a twister, but the strongest ever recorded on Earth, and they may have exceeded the upper wind speeds for an F5 tornado on the original Fujita scale. Even the somewhat lower wind speeds on the ground were extremely punishing to anything caught in their way, throwing vehicles hundreds of meters, sweeping homes off their foundations, and stripping the bark clean off of trees. Sadly, in that area, 12 people perished in the nightmarish conditions, and 44 others were seriously hurt. In the decades since, only a handful of twisters have even come close to surpassing the speed of the May 3rd tornado's winds. However, because such wind speeds were not directly measured by instruments at the site, they were not officially recognized as a record-breaking event. For that reason, the official distinction for the fastest wind on Earth is retained by a 253-mile-per-hour wind gust on Australia's Barrow Island from Cyclone Olivia in 1996. Bridge Creek, Oklahoma, was and remains a small, rural community of several hundred residents, mostly in scattered, outlying homes, but it lies only a short distance from Oklahoma City and its densely populated suburbs. Had the tornado of 1999 carved deeper into Oklahoma City proper rather than the southern city limits, the result would likely have been tens of thousands of deaths and even more numerous injuries, as well as potentially catastrophic damage to the more built-up areas of the state's largest city. When a tornado tears through your community, sometimes survival is just the beginning. The entire fabric of society is disrupted. One of the worst imaginable dangers that tornadoes can present is extremely rare, and yet it lurks in the background if so much as a tornado watch is issued. After 38 minutes of mayhem, 161 deaths, well over 1,000 injuries, and a third of the city left in ruins, the Joplin EF5 tornado of May 22, 2011 finally lifted back into the clouds. But the carnage did not end after the tornado left the city streets. Unbeknownst to many, the seeds of a new disaster were just beginning to take root. 6 days after the tornado passed, one of the many injured victims sought medical care from one of the few remaining health facilities in the area after their skin began to blacken around their wounds. Eventually, a white, fuzzy mold would break through the skin's upper layers as if it were a piece of old bread. The appearance of the resulting wounds was utterly ghastly. After 24 days, 13 other people had been hospitalized for the same sickness. This condition was practically unheard of, but doctors were soon able to determine the cause of such catastrophic trauma. During the tornado's progress across Joplin, all of these victims had been caught in the areas of the worst destruction. All were seriously hurt by flying debris or collapsing structures, receiving an average of 5 injuries each. At some point along its path, the tornado had disturbed soil in which the fungus, Apophis trapeziformis, was present, and when the victims were wounded, the cloud of dirt kicked up by the tornado deposited the fungal spores deep within their flesh. Once inside, it spread for days and even weeks before being noticed. In one patient, it even grew into their bones. The spores blocked the flow of blood through the infected area, causing the tissue to blacken and die like gangrene. The fungus was so aggressive that when placed inside of a petri dish in a laboratory, it grew rapidly enough to forcibly dislodge the lid within hours before spilling over the sides. With that in mind, you can only imagine what that process looks like inside a human body. To say the least, it must be unspeakable to experience the worst kind of tornado possible, to lose everything you own, to be badly injured, and to go through all of that only to succumb to a flesh-eating infection just when you think the worst of the ordeal is over. Although treatments do exist for such infections, they are extremely unpleasant, and their effectiveness is far from guaranteed. The flesh ahead of the infected area has to be cut away to a depth that the spores of the fungus have not yet reached, in a process referred to as debridement. To make matters worse, the average victim of these infections had to undergo 4 debridements each. For one of these victims, the infection made its way so deep into his body that his ribcage had to be replaced with a titanium substitute. However gruesome, this treatment proved to be successful in most of the cases observed. 60% of them would survive, but 5 of the 13 people infected eventually died. The survivors themselves required months of antifungal therapy, followed by years of painkillers and follow-up surgeries, not to mention the psychological trauma from the combined agonies in so short a time. After the crisis finally ended, investigators searched the path of the Joplin tornado, but could not locate the natural source of the fungus. It could still be out there today, posing a threat not just in the immediate area, but in warm, moist, and tornado-prone climates all over the world. Considering that Joplin has been the victim of 3 significant or severe tornadoes since 1971, the elusive origin of the danger, and the end of the EF5 drought in 2025, the same potential exists for another such disaster in the future. Although the super outbreak of April 2011 was responsible for a larger number of individual tornadoes, there were even more violent tornadoes in the super outbreak of 1974. Many of these F4 and F5 twisters would be widely dispersed across several states and counties within them, and there would only be one highly notable exception. Early in the evening of April 3, 1974, one of the most volatile occurrences of the outbreak took place deep in the northwest corner of Alabama, as residents of Limestone and Madison counties watched hundreds of tornadoes tear across the nation on TV and radio. They had no idea what lay in store for them. Before the day was over, it would be their communities making headlines across America. Just before 6 o'clock, these 2 counties found themselves squarely in the sights of the super outbreak. A funnel cloud described as a dark cylindrical tower touched down in Lawrence County, where it killed 8 people trying to flee by car, and 6 others elsewhere. It then tracked into Limestone County, tearing through the small town of Tanner, leveling 2/3 of a trailer park and much of the town itself, before cutting through the communities of Capshaw and Harvest. Many cars, businesses, and houses, mobile or otherwise, were left as piles of debris or vanished altogether. All told, half of the 28 deaths caused by this tornado occurred in these 3 communities. To have even one tornado rip through one small town would be terrible enough, let alone several towns in a row, but this twister was of F5 strength, and the 5th such tornado of the super outbreak. The worst part was that even this traumatizing anomaly was not the end of the nightmare. Just half an hour after the first tornado began, a second funnel soon formed, which touched down only minutes after the first had disappeared. The second tornado was just as large and powerful as the first, and within 30 minutes of the first tornado's arrival, the communities of Tanner, Capshaw, and Harvest were struck once more. The damage path of the second tornado overlapped with the damage path of the first, but sometimes they diverged by as much as 2 miles. The points at which they overlapped were destroyed even more thoroughly than before, and where they split, many parts of these communities that had survived the first tornado were swept away by the second. 16 people who had made it through the first tornado alive or shown up to help were caught in the open and killed, and the survivors were little better off. Hundreds of people were hurt, many of them severely. One victim was impaled vertically on a fence post, and another had a tree branch thrown through their chest. The physical destruction left in the two twisters' wake was marvelous in its completion. In the worst part of both tornadoes' shared damage path, one observer noted that the only identifiable pieces of debris were a handful of bed springs from a destroyed mattress. Between 1950 and 2023, the entire United States saw a single F5 or EF5 rated tornado every year, and sometimes none at all. However, the three closely located towns of Tanner, Capshaw, and Harvest were struck by two F5 tornadoes within the same hour. The victims of the disaster had experienced the unthinkable, a terrifying encounter with back-to-back violent tornadoes. One source later reported that the floors of nearby hospitals serving the victims were slippery with blood. Both twisters were on the ground for more than an hour, and by the time they were done, 50 people were dead, 510 were wounded, and over 1,000 buildings were reduced to rubble, and sometimes even less. Of those who perished, 30 lived in one of the communities hit by the twin twisters. Ominously, the two F5 tornadoes of April 3, 1974, would not be their first or last brush with severe storms of this kind. 5 smaller and weaker tornadoes were reported in the surrounding area throughout the following night, and both Tanner and Harvest would be devastated once more by the Phil Campbell EF5 twister during the super outbreak of 2011, and by several other tornadoes in the years since.